Hey everyone, I noticed that 99.7% of my views come from non-subscribers. If you're enjoying the horror stories on Mystic Spooky, please hit that subscribe button to support the channel. It only takes a second, and it helps me keep creating more spooky content. Sarah lived in a small, quiet town. She had always loved the peace and comfort of her little house. The house sat on the edge of town, surrounded by tall trees that stood like silent guardians around her property. Winters were long and cold, but they were also peaceful. That was something she enjoyed about this town. Nothing much ever happened. It was the middle of winter, the kind where the snow piles high and the nights seem to stretch on forever. That night, Sarah decided to settle in with a cup of hot cocoa, wrap herself in a thick blanket, and watch the snow fall from her favorite spot, a big window that looked out over her front yard. The snow always looked so calm, floating down gently, covering the ground like a soft blanket. The streetlights cast a soft glow over the yard, and the world outside seemed almost magical in the quiet stillness. She loved moments like this, where it felt like the world had slowed down, and she was the only person awake in the silence of the night. But as Sarah sipped her cocoa and watched the snow, something strange caught her eye. At the far edge of her yard, near the line of trees, there was a figure standing in the shadows. It was hard to make out any details because they were standing just beyond the reach of the porch light. For a moment, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. Maybe it was just a tree or a bush covered in snow that looked like a person, but then the figure moved. At first, Sarah tried to stay calm. She told herself it was probably just someone passing through. Maybe a neighbor had gotten lost, or someone had wandered too far from the main road. Her house wasn't far from the edge of town, and sometimes people got confused in the dark, especially with the heavy snow. But something about the way the figure stood there, not moving, just staring in her direction, made her feel uneasy. She squinted, trying to make out more details, but all she could see was the rough outline of someone tall, wearing a long coat or maybe a heavy jacket. Their face was hidden by a hood, and they weren't moving any closer. Just standing there, watching. Sarah's heartbeat quickened. She told herself to relax. Maybe it was just someone who needed help, but why were they just standing there in the cold, not coming to the door or calling out? The longer the figure stood there, the more uncomfortable she felt. A cold chill crept up her spine that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, the figure began to move. Slowly, they took a step forward, then another, but they stayed just out of the light, as if they didn't want to be seen clearly. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the figure moved closer to the house, still not saying anything, not making any noise at all. Her mind raced. Should she call the police? But what would she say? There was just someone standing in her yard. They weren't doing anything yet. She didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was someone looking for help. But something deep inside her told her that this wasn't normal. This wasn't someone who had gotten lost in the snow. The figure came closer, now standing at the edge of her porch, but still staying in the shadows. Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she watched them from her spot by the window. She wanted to move, to grab her phone, to do something, but her body felt frozen in place. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figure turned and began walking around the side of the house, disappearing from her view. For a few seconds, Sarah just sat there, her mind struggling to catch up with what she had just seen. Then, like a switch had been flipped, she jumped up from the couch and ran to the back of the house. Her heart was pounding as she remembered something that sent a wave of panic crashing over her. The back door wasn't locked. Sarah never locked it. She lived in a small town where nothing ever happened, and besides, who would come all the way out here in the middle of winter? But now, as she heard the crunch of footsteps in the snow behind her house, She cursed herself for being so careless. She reached the back door just in time to hear the faintest creak as it began to open. Without thinking, she threw herself against the door, slamming it shut and fumbling with the lock. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely get the lock to turn. But after what felt like an eternity, she finally heard the reassuring click of the deadbolt sliding into place. For a moment, everything was quiet. Sarah pressed her ear against the door, holding her breath, listening for any sign of the person on the other side. She could hear the faint sound of breathing, low, slow, almost as if someone was standing right on the other side, waiting. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. She waited, heart pounding, every muscle in her body tense. But after a few minutes, there was nothing. No footsteps, no sounds. Just the silence of the winter night. She stayed there, frozen by the door, for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she crept back to the front of the house, her body still shaking with fear. She looked out the window again, half expecting to see the figure still standing in her yard, but it was gone. The snow-covered yard was empty, except for a trail of footprints leading from the front yard around the side of the house. The figure had vanished into the night, leaving only their eerie presence behind. The next morning, after barely sleeping a wink, Sarah stepped outside to inspect the yard. She wanted to see if the footprints were really there, or if her mind had played tricks on her. The snow was untouched, except for the faint outline of the footsteps she had seen the night before. But as she turned to go back inside, something caught her eye. On the window, the same window she had been sitting by the night before, there was a single, clear handprint pressed against the glass. Her heart stopped. The handprint wasn't on the outside. It was on the inside. When Reddit user Jake moved into his new apartment, everything seemed perfect. He had just gotten a job in the city, and the 2-bedroom apartment was the ideal size for him and his best friend, Ryan. They had been friends since college, and after living in cramped dorms and cheap rentals, this place felt like an upgrade. The apartment was in an older building, the kind that had character, creaky floors, tall windows, and a bit of history. It was on the top floor, with a view of the city skyline. The first few days went by without a hitch. Jake and Ryan were excited to finally have a place of their own. They spent their time unpacking, hanging up posters, and exploring the neighborhood. But it didn't take long for things to start feeling off. It started with little things. Jake would come home from work and find something slightly out of place. At first, it was small stuff. His books would be moved, or his desk chair would be pushed away from the desk when he was sure he had left it tucked in. He didn't think much of it at first. Maybe Ryan had been in his room looking for something, or maybe he had just forgotten how he left things. But when Jake asked Ryan about it, his friend always gave the same answer. "I haven't been in your room, man." It wasn't just the misplaced objects that were strange. Sometimes, Jake would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. They were soft, almost like someone was walking barefoot down the hallway outside his door. He figured it was just Ryan going to the kitchen or bathroom, but the footsteps didn't stop. They would pace back and forth, as if someone was slowly walking up and down the hallway, over and over again. One night, after being woken up for the 3rd time that week by the footsteps, Jake got up and opened his door, expecting to see Ryan. But the hallway was empty. He walked down to Ryan's room and knocked softly. "Hey, you up?" Jake called through the door. After a moment, Ryan opened the door, rubbing his eyes. He looked confused. "What's up?" "I heard footsteps," Jake said, glancing back at the hallway. "Were you just out there?" Ryan shook his head. "No, man. I've been asleep." "Why?" Jake stared at his friend for a moment, then shrugged. "No reason. I just thought I heard something." Ryan went back to bed, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He lay awake for hours, listening, but the footsteps didn't come back that night. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences became more frequent. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. Jake started noticing other things. Lights would be on when no one was home. The TV would turn on by itself in the middle of the night, and once, he came home to find all the kitchen chairs pulled out from the table, as if someone had been sitting there but left in a hurry. One night, Jake decided he had had enough. He wanted to catch whatever, or whoever, was causing these disturbances. He stayed up late, sitting in the dark living room, waiting. The apartment was silent, except for the faint hum of the city outside the windows. Then, around 2 a.m., he heard it again, the soft sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. Jake's heart raced as he sat perfectly still, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving up and down the hall, just like before. But this time, they didn't stop outside his door. Instead, they grew closer, inching toward the living room where he sat in the dark. His breath caught in his throat as the footsteps stopped just outside the doorway. For a long moment, everything was silent. Then, slowly, the doorknob to the hallway began to turn. Jake leapt to his feet, swinging the door open, only to find no one there. The hallway was empty, just as it had been the other times. But the footsteps, they had sounded so real. The next morning, Jake told Ryan everything. Ryan listened quietly, his face growing paler with each word. When Jake finished, Ryan looked at him and said, "I've been hearing them too." For a moment, they both sat in silence, the weight of their shared experience settling in. Then, Ryan suggested they do some research on the building. Maybe there was a logical explanation, something that would make sense of what they had been experiencing. What they found was chilling. Years ago, a man had lived in their apartment. He had been a bit of a recluse, rarely leaving his home, keeping to himself. One night, he had died in the apartment, alone, with no one to notice for days. It wasn't until the neighbors complained about the smell that someone finally found him. From that day on, Jake and Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone in the apartment. The footsteps, the moved objects, the strange noises, they continued. But now, they knew the source. The man who had died there hadn't really left. When Reddit user Emily was 14, her family moved to a small house in the countryside. It was a beautiful place, surrounded by tall trees, rolling hills, and far from the noise and crowds of the city. Her parents had always dreamed of living in a peaceful, secluded spot where they could raise their children away from the busyness of modern life. At first, Emily loved it. The woods behind their house seemed like a magical place, full of secret paths and hidden clearings. She and her little brother, Max, spent hours exploring, climbing trees, and playing hide-and-seek among the tall pines. But after a few months, something strange started to happen. Every time Emily went into the woods alone, she felt like she was being watched. At first, it was just a feeling, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, like someone was standing just behind her, staring. She would spin around, expecting to see Max or one of her parents, but the woods would always be empty. At first, she tried to brush it off as her imagination. After all, the woods could be a bit creepy when the sun started to set, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. But the feeling kept getting stronger. It wasn't just when she was in the woods alone. Sometimes she felt it even when she was in the yard, just standing by the tree line. One evening, as she was walking back to the house from the woods, she heard something behind her. It was a soft rustling sound, like leaves being disturbed. She turned around, expecting to see a deer or maybe a squirrel, but what she saw made her blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the trees, just a few yards away, was a tall, dark figure. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, half hidden in the shadows, watching her. For a long moment, Emily was frozen in place, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. The figure was too tall to be a person, but it didn't look like an animal either. It was just there, like a shadow that had come to life. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly backed away, keeping her eyes on the figure. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. The figure didn't move, didn't make any attempt to come closer, but the feeling of being watched was so strong that it was almost unbearable. Finally, when she was just a few feet from the house, the figure disappeared. It didn't fade or walk away. It was just gone, as if it had never been there at all. Emily ran inside, slamming the door behind her. She wanted to tell her parents what she had seen, but something stopped her. She didn't want to scare them, and besides, what could she even say? That there was a shadowy figure in the woods? They would probably just tell her it was her imagination or a trick of the light. But the next morning, her little brother, Max, came running into the house, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Emily," he cried, "I saw something in the woods." Her heart dropped. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice trembling. Max looked up at her, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a man, standing by the trees. He was watching me. That was the moment Emily knew it wasn't just her imagination. There was something out there, something real, watching them. From that day on, she and Max refused to go into the woods alone. They stuck together, always keeping each other within sight. But the feeling of being watched never went away. Even now, years later, Emily can't shake the memory of that figure. Sometimes, when she's alone at night, she'll look out her window and half expect to see it standing at the edge of the trees, waiting, because she knows, deep down, that whatever was in the woods that day is still out there.